Well, welcome back from your weekend. I'm Colin McEnroe. I should mention that in the second half of today's show, we're going to talk to John D'Agata. John D'Agata is a journalist whose work, one of whose stories became a book called Lifespan of a Fact, which was this kind of annotated analysis of how to fact check something and about a dispute between a writer who took a certain kind of Norman Mailer, Tom Wolfe-like liberties with the truth in order to deepen the effect of his writing, and a very, very sedulous and painstaking fact checker. And that's in turn turned into a play. Bobby Cannavale played John D'Agata on Broadway. And now that I met John D'Agata, they couldn't be more different. Anyway, that's a whole long story. We're not going to talk about that right now. Instead, we're very excited to talk to somebody whose writing I've been reading for a very long time, James Surowiecki, a journalist who has written about business and finance for, among others, Slate and The New Yorker. He's the author of The Wisdom of Crowds. But I will be honest and say that the thing that drew my eye to him most recently, and something we'll talk about a little bit later in this conversation, was a Twitter thread, which is how so many things get started these days, in which he began to advocate for the notion that Connecticut, of all places, should go first in the Democratic primary cycle. And so we'll make that case in just a little while. But it seems like we've got a lot of other news to digest. James Surowiecki, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me on, Colin.
So I don't know. I feel, every 4 years I go through this and then all the memories are neurologically erased. And I feel like I don't remember there being such a short amount of time between South Carolina and Super Tuesday. But here we are kind of digesting the news of Saturday, which really did, I think, Biden's margin in this thing is kind of a big surprise. And we've got, we don't have enough time to digest a pizza, never mind digest a significant change in the race, and we're heading into Super Tuesday. First of all, were you surprised by Biden's margin?
I was surprised by his margin. I wasn't surprised that he won pretty convincingly just because, obviously he had been up in South Carolina in the polls, even despite all of his problems. But also it did, this is very vague, it felt like in the wake of his not that great but not terrible performance in Nevada that there was some feeling kind of building on behalf of him. And then the endorsement of him by James Clyburn, the representative from South Carolina, who's very influential there, I think it was pretty clear it was going to be a big deal, not as big a deal as it seems to have turned out to have been, but I thought that was part of it. And then I think more generally, there was a growing sense among moderates in the party that if something wasn't done, that Bernie was basically just going to coast to the nomination, and that I think freaked a lot of people out.
One of the things that I would love to be right now is a fly on the wall or in some kind of eavesdropping capacity for the next Biden-Obama conversation. Because
Obama.
No,
I agree. It is. A lot of people were mentioning that over the weekend that, if Obama were ever going to endorse Biden, now would be the time to do it. That seems really unlikely. It seems like he kind of wants to stay out of it. But yeah, there was some reporter reported that they exchanged voicemails. Oh no, maybe that was Biden and Buttigieg, but I think Obama and Biden did talk. But I agree, that would be a fascinating conversation. I would love to know just what Obama is telling Biden to do, like if he's giving him any advice. I think it would be very interesting to hear. And
I'd like to know, and this is something that we probably wouldn't get directly from that conversation, why Obama does think he should stay out of it. It does seem ideologically and policy-wise that for obvious reasons, he and Biden tracked together pretty comfortably in a way that he and Bernie, for example, do not. It's interesting. It probably speaks to a little bit to his personality that he doesn't want to become part of the story.
I think that's right. I think it does have. There was a good piece. I'm not going to be able to remember where. It was either in The Hill or Politico a couple of weeks ago about kind of his thought process. And how he was trying to kind of imagine his role and the fact that he didn't want to get into the middle of this. And I do think it has a lot to do with his personality and not wanting to essentially inject himself into obviously what's a very partisan debate. But it is fascinating, especially given that recent report that Bernie Sanders thought about primarying him and personally primarying him in 2012. I mean, we knew Bernie had called for someone to primary Obama in 2012. So yeah, it is very interesting. I mean, I think in terms of what you were talking about at the top of the show, in terms of the short period between South Carolina and Super Tuesday, it's not just the margin of victory that changed things. I think, to be honest, Biden's speech after the win made a big difference too, because he did seem like a different candidate. He seemed much less tired. He seemed less old, frankly. He seemed more energized. And then, we also now have Buttigieg dropping out, which is also something that's really complicating or making more interesting the math for tomorrow.
Well, I think another thing that may explain Obama's reticence and a whole bunch of other things as well. And I mean, we shouldn't. There's this thing I call the narcissism of the moment, where we all assume that the moment we're in is the most extreme version of these kinds of moments. So I look at this particular primary field, and I think that the persecution complex that not so much Bernie Sanders himself, but his acolytes exhibit creates a kind of tension that I'm not used to. Obviously, every primary season is tense. 2008 was very tense between Obama and Clinton and Obama's people and Clinton's people. I mean, pick a cycle that actually has a contested primary, and it's probably the case. But there's a way, I think, in which the Bernie Sanders is, inner circle of admirers will see in any setback or a defeat as something a little bit more dark and nefarious than just the typical twists and turns that a primary season takes. They tend to personalize stuff a lot. And as I say, that's not that unusual for a primary season, but it seems like a little bit more from them. Am I crazy to be saying that?
No. I mean, at least certainly my experience as someone who has tangled with Bernie supporters on Twitter a lot is something like that. I mean, I think in this particular case, I wouldn't be surprised if Obama was taking some of that into account, in the sense that if he did step in and endorse, it would obviously be seen as a sign, justifiably, of the Democratic establishment really kind of throwing its full weight behind Biden, which obviously to some degree it's already supporting him. And I do think that would amplify the sense of persecution or hostility from the sort of mainstream Democrats that a lot of Bernie supporters feel. And, if you're not convinced that one of the interesting calculations for Obama also would have to be, if he endorses, does that guarantee Biden the nomination? I would suspect not. And although I think it would certainly help. And you don't want to be in a position of endorsing and then having your candidate not win. That would not be a good thing for a lot of different reasons, I think. And so that may also be part of the calculation. I mean, I suspect if we end up in July and it is a contested convention, which is increasingly looking, I think, likely, then I would be shocked if he did not step in to try to play a role as, peacemaker or finding some way to kind of build bridges. I mean, it feels like that's kind of in some ways maybe what he's waiting for.
Right. I think that's right, that he's kind of keeping his powder dry for that moment where he can sort of at least present himself as somebody who hasn't taken a side yet. And I also think, to your point, there's a way in which the Democratic Party has to be a little bit nervous collectively about at least the argument that it's history repeating itself. So in 2016, you had the establishment kind of pre-back Clinton in a way that seemed to crowd out all other possibilities. Suddenly, Bernie runs this insurgent campaign. It catches fire way more than people had thought. And at the end of the whole process, there were a lot of us who were saying, well, it was a change cycle. It was a cycle about people seeking significant change in the distribution of power and the workings of American government. And Clinton was a very poor standard bearer for that. She seemed to be very much part of the establishment and not someone heavily committed to change in the way that Sanders did. And it made her a poor dueling partner for Trump. This cycle, though, is not that cycle. And I think that's maybe a thing that the people backing Biden, I think, need to sort of make that point and have that point be understood, that if there's opposition to Sanders this time, it may have a different reason. Because to me, this cycle is about just getting power back away from Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is that sense of, Biden has used this language, I think, the idea of just kind of a return to normalcy, that that there is a sense in which a lot of Americans, I think, just want to go back to something that feels normal. And I think 2016 did feel very different. I mean, I have a slightly different take on 2016, which is, I think in some ways we underestimated how much people hated Hillary Clinton, just literally Hillary Clinton. And that drove a lot of voters, both in the Democratic primary and then also in the general election. And so, the joke, which I totally believe, is that I think Martin O'Malley would have won in a walk if he had gotten the nomination. I don't think he would have had any problem beating Trump. And that may be wrong, but I do think there was something about Hillary herself, particularly in an election where a lot of people were thinking about change, that she seemed to embody so much of what people didn't like about kind of American politics. And then obviously you layer in the sexism and the particular hatred of the Clintons that so many Republicans feel. And it was an unusual thing. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the Democratic establishment threw its weight behind her. And I do think they have to be a little gun shy about doing so with Biden, because the one thing let me say this quickly, is I think one of the things that is interesting about 2020 is the Democratic establishment has not gone all in on Biden, or certainly had not done so until maybe the last few days. Not just Obama, just generally, he had not been someone who had gotten a ton of endorsements. There was not look at how much trouble he's had raising money. I mean, he's way behind Bernie. He's way behind Buttigieg, for that matter, in terms of the amount of money he's raised. So they actually have not gone all in on him. And I think, that 2016 may be in part responsible for that.
Right. And another part of this, and this will sort of lead us maybe a little bit towards part of the conversation we need to have anyway, is this cycle didn't lay out well for him, so that, I will confess, I think after Nevada, I used the term dead man walking or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, an awful lot of people had really pronounced this guy dead. This isn't just sort of, he's reestablished himself. He was tipping a little bit and he got the boat up and sailing. A lot of people had just completely counted him out of this process. And I don't know if that's sort of an indictment of punditry or the just weird weighting of the way the primary and caucus cycle goes.
I mean, I think it's a couple things. I mean, I think there is a little bit, we're obviously, prone to overreact. I mean, if you go back to last January, the polls look, or let's say April, the polls look pretty much where they are now. So, if you just had jumped ahead 12 months, you would have been like, oh yeah, this is pretty much what we thought it was going to be. Biden versus Sanders, blah, blah, blah. So there's a little bit of overreacting. I think some of it was just the way the primary cycle ran, the order of the primaries worked, and we'll talk about that. But I do think Biden deserves some blame, or whatever you want to call it, for it, because it wasn't just that he wasn't getting the results. He also just, I don't know how else to put it, he just seemed out of it. He seemed really old. I don't mean like chronologically old. He just seemed old in the sense of he did not seem like he was really there. I mean, I remember watching an appearance that he made before like firefighters in Philadelphia. And this was a few weeks before or maybe a month before he announced. And they were chanting, run, Joe, run. And he said like, you should probably save that for in a little bit. But the way he said it and just his entire manner seemed so tired that I think it was just hard to imagine him up against Trump, who, for all of his many problems, certainly always seems energetic and robust in a kind of weird way. And so I do think Biden, himself was driving part of people's reaction. But I totally agree. I mean, I think even before Nevada, I was like, I don't see how he can do this. But I don't know. His speech in South Carolina was very good, and he does have this ability to connect with voters one-on-one. That there's no question about that in my mind.
Right. And a lot of it will be post Super Tuesday, whether he can kind of stay away from that other version of it. I mean, it was within the last week to 10 days, he's done stuff like he seemed to think he was running for the U.S. Senate at one point.
Yep.
He seemed to think he'd been arrested along with Nelson Mandela at another point. It turned out it was Martha and the Vandellas. He just got it mixed up. I just, so he's got to stay away from that, obviously. He's got to seem to be this new sort of clear-headed guy. Hey, just as I'm kind of managing the clock here, as we head towards a convention, one point that you made to producer Betsy Kaplan, I think, is, and it's so true, everybody on social media, everybody thinks they know what the rules of the convention are.
Yeah.
And basically, except for this guy, Dave Camper, that you pointed us out to, it's Camper with a K, by the way, on Twitter, nobody knows I thought I knew what the rules of the convention were, but there's certain parts of it that I didn't understand. So it might be worth just taking a moment to say, well, say whatever you want about the rules of the convention.
Well, I mean, I think there are two things that are probably worth keeping in mind for people. I mean, there are more than that, but let's say two. So the first is this is before you get to the convention. So this is obviously, we know that in the primaries, there's this 15% threshold rule, which you have to get to 15% in the state or in any individual congressional district to get any delegates at all. So that's why the Buttigieg decision to drop out starts to get very interesting, because one of the consequences of that is that will almost certainly send Biden, definitely, and also perhaps candidates like Elizabeth Warren and maybe even Bloomberg over the 15% threshold in states that they were not going to hit it in otherwise. And the consequence of that is that it will put a real dent in the total number of delegates Bernie is probably going to take on Super Tuesday. Because if you're the only person over 15% in a state, or one of two, you can really get a huge haul of delegates, even if you're only polling 35% of the vote. So that changes the math. And one of the consequences is that it's becoming increasingly unlikely that any candidate is going to get a majority of delegates before the convention. And I think it's getting increasingly unlikely that any candidate is going to have a really big plurality. So once you get to the convention, on the first ballot, you're not legally bound, but pretty much everyone will vote for the candidate that they have, been pledged to. Or if, say, Buttigieg endorses Biden, most of Buttigieg's delegates will probably, support Biden or whatever it is.
Right, but they don't have to. We should say that too.
They don't have to.
Yeah.
And the second part, they definitely don't have to. So some of them will go somewhere else. But then it gets really interesting, because after that, on the second ballot, and then every ballot after that, those delegates are essentially free to vote for whomever they want. So while a lot of the paranoia, or I shouldn't say paranoia, a lot of the concern from, say, Bernie supporters have been about the super delegates, who are these basically Democratic Party officials or elected, every member of the House of Representatives and so on, about them having a vote on the second ballot. The real power is going to be in the delegates, because there's about 4,000 of them. There are only like 700 super delegates. And, it's going to be really interesting if we get there, because there's going to be a lot of horse trading. There's going to be a lot of basically cajoling. But ultimately, the delegates get to decide for themselves. They're not pledged once the first ballot is done. And I don't think we really know what will happen. It could be just completely fascinating.
No, I've certainly covered floor fights at the state level, but I've never covered a floor fight at that magnitude. It would be very interesting. All right. So as I said at the beginning, one of the things that I suddenly noticed one Sunday morning or whenever it was that James Surowiecki was proposing on Twitter that maybe Connecticut should go first, not Iowa, not New Hampshire, not Nevada. So give us your argument for that.
Well, I mean, the simple idea is basically that the Connecticut's demographics actually look like the United States. I mean, almost exactly is overstating it, but certainly in terms of, say, race and ethnicity, they look very, very similar to the United States. So you would have a state that, instead of starting with two nearly all white states like Iowa and New Hampshire, you would have a state where, candidates would really be trying to reach across all demographic groups. And that's obviously, I think, important, because starting in Iowa and New Hampshire does skew the race. It gives people who aren't really able to appeal, say, to black voters, or don't seem to have much appeal, a leg up. By contrast, it hurt someone like Joe Biden very clearly this year because he's so strong in the black community. And I think it's also just not a great thing for the Democratic Party, which is by far a more diverse party than Republicans, to be starting in these two states that really don't look anything like the United States and really don't look anything like the Democratic Party. But it's actually more than that. I mean, Connecticut also is a small state, so that's important because, ideally you do want to give people who are kind of upstarts or insurgents a chance to build strength over time, not have to spend a huge amount of money right away. So some people have suggested, well, maybe we should start with Illinois or Pennsylvania. I think that just changes the math of it in a way that's probably not that useful. So Connecticut is small. It's about the same size as Iowa in terms of population, but it's also geographically much more compact, obviously. So that makes it easier for people to travel around, makes it easier for the kind of retail politics that primaries generally feature, early primaries feature, the kind of stuff you see in New Hampshire and Iowa. I think that's all really good. And then, when I think about Connecticut, I mean, part of this comes from the fact. So I just moved back to Connecticut in the fall from Brooklyn, but I grew up here. I was born here, and when I went to college in North Carolina, and I told people I was from Connecticut, they all were like, "Oh, it's so fancy, it's so hoity-toity," which I thought was weird because I was born in Meriden and I lived in Enfield. Meriden, basically an old Rust Belt town. Yeah. Enfield, a pretty ordinary suburban town. And Connecticut, to me, is also very diverse in terms of the range of locales it has, in terms of the kinds of cities it has. It has Rust Belt towns. It has these big old cities. It has, little middle class towns. It has the Gold Coast, whatever. It's a genuinely representative, I think, picture of the United States. And there was this great study that 538 did 2 years ago where they looked at what city looked most like the United States as a whole or what metropolitan region. And the metropolitan region they picked was New Haven, Milford. And I live in New Haven now, and that makes total sense to me. And Hartford was like third or fourth. And I just think if it's a candidate who could appeal to Connecticut voters is a candidate that you would be confident could actually appeal to America. And to me, it seems like, why would you not start there? That seems like the place you want to start if you're the Democratic Party.
Well, also, I would make 2 points. One of them is, in terms of Connecticut's reputation, astronomers have recently, or astrophysicists have recently concluded that the actual average color of the universe is beige. So I feel like that's somehow or other that's a point in Connecticut's favor, although I'm not really sure how I would make that connection. But also, Connecticut, rather than being politically as staid and small c socially conservative or personally conservative as its reputation might suggest. In 92, Connecticut went for Jerry Brown, and that's with the entire Democratic machinery led by Joe Lieberman and the Democratic state chairman and everything pushing hard for Clinton. Clinton was supposed to win Connecticut, and Jerry Brown insurgents tipped it the other way. And even on the Republican side, speaking of conventions and releasing your delegates, I was at Philadelphia in 2000, where Connecticut had gone for McCain, and McCain had released everybody to W, and the Connecticut people wouldn't do it. I was at meetings where there's...
No, exactly. That's right. Yeah. So, and I think it's also an interesting state because it's obviously, it goes Democratic in presidential elections, but it's obviously has a certain purple element to it. If you look at both state politics and then also national politics, at least historically. So yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons why it makes a lot of sense. The one thing people push back on a lot was the presence of New York makes it too expensive. There may be something to that in terms of media buys, but that really is about a certain part of the state. And to my mind, I don't think that's a good enough reason, certainly to stick with Iowa and New Hampshire. I mean, I have no confidence this is going to happen. I still think it's weird that states decide which goes first. It seems but just bizarre to me. But I really do think it would be it's kind of a no-brainer for the Democratic Party to do it.
Right. And plus, we can both start Airbnbs, and at least for a little while, we'll be rolling in bucks. No, sir, just very little time left. But there was this kind of sense at the end of the Iowa debacle this year of everybody saying, well, that's it for you, Iowa. You're not going to get to do this anymore. But I wonder about that. First of all, I think people forget pretty quickly. I think by 2022, people are not going to remember enough to be excited about what's going to happen in 2024. But there may also not be the machinery to take anything away from Iowa if it doesn't want to release it, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the real strange thing is the fact that states still do seem to have I've never really been able to make any kind of logical sense of it, but it actually is much harder to for the Democratic or Republican parties to arrange the primary schedule the way they want than you would think it would be. Now, obviously, you can do it to some degree. That's how Super Tuesday got created. But it requires a lot of lobbying. And I definitely think that, for Iowa and New Hampshire, it's just a huge deal to do. I mean, it makes sense. They're kingmakers to some degree. Although, you're going to look at this year, one of the things that will help make the case against Iowa is, look, so Pete Buttigieg finishes first or second, depending on your perspective, in Iowa, and he's dropped out before Super Tuesday. So maybe, what really is the point? And but I wouldn't be surprised if you're right. And in fact, when things roll around, we end up back in this situation. I mean, because the other aspect of this is if they do nothing else, they should scrap the caucus and just replace it with a primary, because the caucus system is itself, I think, crazily undemocratic. But it does feel like the kind of thing that may be easier said than done, and certainly easier to do a Twitter thread about than actually make happen in reality.
Oh, no. How could that be true?
I know, exactly.
James Surowiecki, it's so great to talk to you, a journalist who's written about business and finance for, among others, Slate and The New Yorker, now back living in Connecticut where he belongs, the author of The Wisdom of Crowds. We have to take a little break now. I have a chance right now to thank Betsy Kaplan, senior producer, for setting up this show. Kat Pastor is on the board. And did you know that, by the way, if your state's willing to go later, they give you more delegates? I just found that out this year. And I think you get a toaster, too. Connecticut is the place. So, welcome back. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm actually recording this at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday. So, John D'Agata, when did the book Lifespan of a Fact come out?
It came out in 2012.
Because I think somebody, and I thought it was you, but I think it might be your collaborator, came on this show at the time to talk about the book when it came out. So anyway, Lifespan of a Fact is playing at TheaterWorks right now here in Hartford. The author, John D'Agata, is here. John D'Agata is an essayist, professor of English, and director of the nonfiction writing program at the University of Iowa, the author of 6 books, including Lifespan of a Fact, which we're talking about right now. It's a book, it's a play, it's a line of sheets and towels at JCPenney. So I'm going to have you summarize the play.
Well, I didn't write the play.
I know.
But
you're a character in the play.
I am someone who shares a name with a character in the play.
Better way to put it.
Let's see.
Do you want me to try to summarize it and you can correct me?
Yeah, it's not my play.
All right. So this is a play essentially about a dispute about a magazine essay that is going to be published. The essay is about the suicide of a young person in Las Vegas. And the magazine that is publishing the essay has sent a very young, mostly untested, but almost obsessively cautious fact checker to fact check the piece. And he has, I don't want to spoil too many things, but he has taken his mission very, very seriously. And so what ultimately happens, what unfolds before you is a debate that sometimes turns into an argument, that sometimes escalates into a fight between the author and the fact checker, and it is mediated at times by the editor of the magazine. I'm going to get you into this conversation now, John. The argument is really about whether or not every single thing, every single little detail in a story has to be true, or whether the slight alteration of certain details can create a larger, more profound, more poetic truth by being set free from the minutiae of tiny little facts.
I think point of fact, I could say that your summary isn't totally accurate because the story and the play is based on real experiences that the fact checker and I had, but not real events.
No, would almost have to be the case.
Yeah.
That certain liberties have been taken there. But see, that's interesting too, because obviously the whole conversation begins about taking liberties or what the fact checker sees as liberties. Perhaps the author, John D'Agata, wouldn't use the word liberties because there's an implicit kind of violation in that word.
I do use the word liberties. Okay. Probably John in the character, who is a little more stubborn than I am, would not use the word liberties. He, I think, suspects that he is, by taking his liberties, telling a truer version of the story, and that the facts were getting in the way of his ability to do that.
Yeah, sometimes he wants a certain rhythm of prose. Sometimes he feels as though a certain tiny alteration of a tiny little, mostly insignificant number has some kind of sonic thrust to it. But this is unacceptable to the fact checker. This is completely unacceptable to the fact checker, who regards all of this, any departure from the truth. Well, why don't we let the fact checker speak for himself? This is from the Theater Works production that is up right now, which John D'Agata at this very moment has not yet seen, but we'll see tonight. And you'll hear the three characters having a bit of an argument about how one might even be remembered if one took liberties.
No one can hide anything anymore. You fudge a number here, you alter a detail there, they will find you out.
You can't make me responsible.
When the blogs and the fan sites and Twitter and 4chan and Reddit and whatever in the whole insane internet, when they start tearing you down brick by red brick, they're not going to say, wow, John D'Agata altered certain details in the service of poetic truth. They're going to say, wow, John D'Agata lied.
Since the time you wrote the book, and as this play has been unfolding and become the thing that it's become, a slightly different conversation about truth and facts has been taking place in our society. I don't know, does that change this whole thing for you? As you're sitting there in the audience watching it, what are you thinking?
I hear your question. It's a good question. It's an important question. I'm usually enjoying the play. I'm usually hoping the laughs land because it is meant to be a funny play.
Yeah.
But obviously, I have a different relationship to this character who is making these claims than most people. When the book came out, I remember the John character in the book being compared to Lance Armstrong. And I'm not sure I've actually heard anyone say that this John character is, what he's arguing is giving license to Donald Trump. But I can imagine people saying that, and that's problematic. But I think at the core of the play, and certainly at the core of the book, it's important to remember that really what this character is talking about is a literary issue. He's interested in literary essays that go back, millennia. He might be the only one who's viewing the issue as that and not one that's speaking to the current political climate. But that was my purpose in writing the book. And it actually was the purpose of the playwrights, too. This was put together years before the current climate that we're in. I
want to talk about that issue of form, too, because I think within the whole framework of the literary essay, when I read a literary essay, if I'm sick and I want medical information, I don't read Virginia Woolf's essay on being ill, right?
Right.
I wouldn't be doing that. I'd be reading Virginia Woolf for a completely different reason, for whatever empathy and perspective is in there. But I mean, basically, I'm also probably going to read, the New England Journal of Medicine or something for the actual medical information. But that's an interesting question, too, is what does the reader think the bargain is between him and the writer? And with that piece in particular about the suicide in Las Vegas, does the reader understand the implicit intentions of the essayist, of you creating some kind of different literary truth than what would satisfy a Harvard fact checker?
It's a complicated issue because I think the reader used to understand that there was a difference. Around the 1950s, 1960s, all subgenres within nonfiction started to, at least in readers' minds, merge under this title nonfiction, which is a very new literary term. And so everything that could exist under that umbrella, including journalism, including memoir, including essays, including highly experimental hybrid things all fall under this umbrella term. And because of that, we've started to insist, I think, that even the sacred social service of journalism and the fact that it exists under this term right alongside things like memoir and essay and lyric essay and biography and whatnot, it seems like readers have started to assume that everything be written with the same standards of journalism. And that emerged with new journalism in the 50s and 60s. And it's a standard that I can say in my writing program, which is training some of the best young writers in the country, that's not what they're writing toward. And so it's a problem. And it's mostly our fault, I think, as essayists for not doing as good a job as fiction writers and poets.
I don't agree.
Okay.
I don't agree that it's your fault. First of all, I think this moves historically in cycles. So Tom Wolfe wants to write something, and he wants to, do some real new journalism in which he injects himself and his perceptions, and he perhaps, takes some liberties, we're back to that word, with stuff that's going on. And I don't think it's as big a problem because if you really wanted to know something about Leonard Bernstein, you could find it out from somebody else.
Sure.
But now it's less clear who you go to at the end of a Degata essay, or at the end of one of David Foster Wallace's essayist pieces. Well, let's say you really need to know something about lobsters and you don't trust David Foster Wallace. What do you do now? And I think the answer to that question is much more of a jump ball than it used to be.
I think you're making sense. I think I disagree.
Okay, good. Just disagree a little bit more. And then
I just disagree as a person, not as a writer, not
okay.
as a
disagree as a person.
I just disagree as an American because we can't forfeit ourselves to that idea.
I agree that we can't forfeit ourselves, but I think you have to acknowledge conditions on the ground right now. And in addition to what I'm doing right now with you, I read a newspaper column that appears in 8 newspapers. Today is the day it runs, and I get emails. And it's absolutely the case that there isn't a source that I could cite for some of the things that I say that would satisfy the people who are angry at me on a given Sunday morning.
Yeah.
So what do you do in that situation,
Well, you don't do anything. I mean, there is something to be said for we readers taking some responsibility for what we're reading and for critically analyzing what we're going to make of it. And it's an impossible conversation to have if the argument is that the New York Times can't be trusted anymore.
I hope I'm not articulating a total declinist argument about that. But I do think there's something fundamentally broken right now in a worse way than it would have been broken in 2012. There's this really interesting push and pull going on between you and the fact checker, and you're both right. I mean, I think it's possible to read that book or watch this play and think, well, they're both right, but there's some irreconcilable areas between the two of them. But that doesn't, it's a very sort of, kind of Hegelian thing, that you ultimately you let both of them have some of their argument. That's the only way you can walk out of there sane.
You think so? Okay.
Okay. Well, what do you think? You just think you're right.
No. I think what's interesting is that none of the characters are right. And at times they're also unlikable. But there are also times when we're cheering for them. There are times I've been in the audience when Jim has given the speech that you played earlier, and there's been a round of applause. And that speech is followed immediately by one from the complete opposite end of the spectrum by John about his mother. And that's followed by a round of applause. And so you're experiencing in the audience simultaneously a belief that the Jim character is absolutely right, the John character is absolutely right, despite the fact that they are saying completely different things. And that's kind of beautiful. I think it's amazing that you can walk out of the theater and not know exactly what to believe, and therefore you need to do some thinking on your own. I think that's a cool experience.
So if you want to set up that contrast, so we played that clip before where the fact checker is talking about how ultimately, because everything is preserved on the internet, because fact is ultimately checkable through the internet, bracket, that's a very dubious proposition, close bracket, that if you say something that's not true, you'll be branded as a liar throughout history and stuff like that. So a round of applause from the audience, and then this speech.
My mother's last words were in this chair. She blacked out. I said, "Goodbye, Mom," right here. Can you confirm that? Can you? Or am I embellishing the facts to make a better story, to get to the truth of what losing my mom felt like? She stopped breathing in the ambulance. The EMTs resuscitated her. We shut off her life support in the hospital. So where'd she die? When did she die? Which is really, really true? Look up this chair in the Pier 1 catalog. It'll tell you the dimensions are 31 by 37. So it couldn't possibly fit in the space, not with room for a walker. So there's no way my mother died in this chair. At least that's what a fact checker will tell you.
All right, that's Rufus Collins playing John D'Agata, a person named John D'Agata who is not exactly the same person who's sitting in my studio, who happens also to be named John D'Agata, all right? And the play is Lifespan of a Fact. And we'll take a little break. We'll come back. We'll talk about more of this.
I'm sick to death of seeing things from tight-lipped condescending mothers little chauffeurs. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth now. I've had enough of watching scenes with schizophrenic, egocentric, paranoid prima donnas. All I want is the truth now.
We're talking to John D'Agata. John D'Agata is both a writer and a character in the play Lifespan of a Fact, a play based on his book. It's at Theater Works in Hartford through March 8th. He is sitting here in the studio with me, the person, not the character, just to, once again, to kind of reset here. So this is a play in which people are sort of arguing about which kind of truth is more important, the most granular kind of fact-checkable, verifiable kind of truth, or a truth, at least in the context of an essay, a truth that derives its power, at least in part, from feelings and sensations that are somewhat detached from fact.
Yeah, I think that's right. But it's important to emphasize that this is a conversation happening in the context of an essay. I don't think that there's anyone in the play, there certainly isn't anyone in the book arguing that this is a legitimate discussion to have when we're talking about journalism.
Right, although some of the tension between Fingal, the fact-checker, and D'Agata, the writer, is sort of about that. I mean, you know, there's the truth of the heart. And in a way, that's the argument that the D'Agata character is making. The truth of the heart, there's a way in which that's more powerful and more profound. I think the Fingal character would say, who gets to arrogate that particular idea? I always go back to Ronald Reagan at the time of the Iran-Contra stuff. He came on TV and he did one of those speeches to the nation. He said, we absolutely did not trade arms for hostages. We didn't, okay? And then 6 weeks later, the Tower Commission is starting to take testimony and stuff like that. He comes back on TV and he goes, 6 weeks ago or whatever it was, I was here on television addressing the nation and I said that we did not trade arms for hostages. I still feel in my heart that that is true. But other details have surfaced and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, there's some facts that have come out that contradict what I believe in my heart. It is a little bit of an example of the so-called slippery slope when you start having a truth of the heart. Like, who's going to get to do that? Just a licensed card-carrying essayist or the freaking president of the United States?
Well, not the president. Absolutely.
Okay.
Because our relationship with a president, our relationship with elected officials is not the same relationship that we have with artists and literary writers.
Yeah.
It can't be. As you said earlier, I don't want my doctor taking liberties with the prescriptions that she's giving me,
right,
or in how she's, reading an EKG.
An EKG, yeah.
An EKG.
You know what your doctor's saying? I just read this Charles Lamb essay about heart problems.
Right. Yeah.
And it's really reshaped my thinking, John, about what you're going through right now. You don't want that.
Yeah. I want whatever textbook she read as a medical student to have been impeccably fact-checked.
Yeah.
I don't need that from a memoir that I'm reading. And I think it's okay for there to be different standards. But I don't have the same relationship, or I have never claimed to have the same relationship with a reader that I personally, as a reader, want to have with my favorite journalists, or that I want to have with a yoga instructor, or that I want to have with my congressional representative, or that I want to have with my doctor, or the person I'm sleeping with. These are all different relationships.
Right.
And there are different levels of trust, and there are different levels of licenses that we give. I also deeply believe that we license the artists with certain liberties because whether or not we acknowledge it, we expect them to go into terrain that is pretty uncomfortable. And we also hope that they will somehow help us find our way into that territory and challenge us a little bit in order to push ourselves into thinking a little bit more deeply about some issues. I don't want the president to be doing that. But.
Well, I mean, part of the problem is, not to sound glib about this, but we used to have higher standards for, at least in the area of factual truth, for the president of the United States than we did for essayists. And I'm not sure that's the case anymore. I think if an essayist and a president told me contradicting versions of the same story, I'd be inclined to believe the essayist because the president is much more clearly these days, an awful lot of the time, a fiction writer. And that's part of the problem, too. These roles are blurring a little bit, too. People might trust their yoga instructor more than they trust their congressperson, and they might not even be entirely wrong about that.
And in a moment like this, which is legitimately scary, it can feel like the safest thing to do is clear-cut our way through all forms of communication that are claiming to take licenses. But the problem is that we risk pulling up the flowers with the weeds. You said earlier that you think something fundamental has broken. I don't think that's the case.
Well, good.
And I think that we have to believe that. You also said earlier that this is a wave. It's that we're experiencing
there's
something
cycles.
cyclical.
There's cycles, yeah.
And that's okay. We're grown-ups.
Some of us are. Well, yeah, no, I agree. And so I think the problem is, okay, so back in 1978, Cicely Bach writes this tremendous philosophical book. It's really almost a long essay called Lying. And has some subtitle like a moral inquiry, blah, blah, blah. But one of her fundamental premises is that our social interactions are based on implicit trust, that if you started with the assumption, kind of like Jim Fingal seems to, at least as a character in the play, that anything that you read might be a lie, anything that anybody said to you might be a lie. Prior to being fact-checked, anything that, like almost the default setting of anything that you hear is that it's possibly or probably untrue. You'd be rendered unable to function, and we'd be unable to. I believe that you are John DeGata because you said so, but you're some guy who turned up in my studio. Yeah,
that'd be really interesting.
But we couldn't do that, right? I mean, if we had to fact check everything, we'd never make it out through the first hour of our day, because in fact, human interaction is based on trust, is based on a belief that we're not being lied to all the time. The problem is that when those expectations turn out to be less true than Cicely Bach thought they were going to be. I mean, there's in a way, in 78, Cicely Bach is writing about something that doesn't exist yet, the internet. The internet, which is full of crap that isn't true. And that might be one of the things that snapped our twig a little bit. It's interesting that Fingal says this in the play, oh, well, the internet is just a great repository for fact-checking and truth. Well, yeah, but the internet is also full of things that are not true, that are exactly the kinds of things Cicely Bach worried about. I'm talking too much. You should talk.
No. I like that idea. I might be really off base saying this, but I don't believe that art can lie.
That's really good.
I think that's all I can say about that. I think I agree with you. We need to be able to trust at certain levels that our relationships with the diversity of people in our lives are based on mutual respect and honesty. But I deeply, deeply do not believe that art can lie.
That's a good place to stop, I think, although I think as John DeGata can tell, much to his discomfort, I could talk about this for another 2.5 hours with him. But we will stop here. Thank you for listening. And thanks to Betsy Kaplan for producing. And we're going to be back tomorrow with something. It's not really at the tip of my tongue, whatever that thing is, but it's going to be excellent. I can guarantee you that, because I would never lie to you, right? You can fact check that, can't you? All right. Thanks for listening.
They say 65% of all statistics are made up right there on the spot. 82.4% of people believe them, whether they're accurate statistics or not. Now, I don't know what you believe, but I do know there's no doubt I needed another double shot of something 90 proof. I got too much to think about. Too much to think about. Too much to figure out. Stuck between hope and doubt. Too much to think